This is the start of a journey which takes us back to the long, hot summer of 1911, a summer of violence and loss of life in the town of Llanelli. It's my hometown. And this is a journey to discover what happened when the workers of this town came face to face with the might of the British state. I want the story to be heard, and I want to set the record straight.
I grew up in Llanelli. I never heard of the Llanelli Riots. I heard about Owen Glyndŵr, I heard about David Lloyd George, I heard about all sorts of people. Never heard about the great event, the big event of 1911 in Llanelli.
I had an aunt who was quite an avid cricket fan, and I remember her asking my uncle, who's playing against Glamorgan today? Oh, Worcester, he said. Oh, she said, the murderers.
I first heard about the events from my grandmother, who remembers the police coming round to her back garden when she was a child and digging up the back gardens in Llanelli, looking for looted produce.
Llanelli at the turn of the 20th century was a town in flux, a town where rural Welsh-speaking Wales met industrial English-speaking Wales, a town where the old chapel traditions met the trends of the modern world. Above all, this was a boomtown.
Llanelli wasn't called Tinopolis for nothing. I mean, in the late 19th century, it was the great industrial centre in its particular sector. And that actually reflected itself in a town which had wonderful buildings, trams, all sorts of facilities which many people envied.
I think the Lord Lieutenant called Llanelli the Garden of Eden of Carmarthenshire. But like the Garden of Eden, a serpent was lurking there, and the serpent was slum housing, with problems of sanitation and child mortality. This was common to all towns who were industrialised at that particular time.
In a town of tin, steel, copper and coal, only 5% of the workforce were railwaymen, but they really were the poorest of the poor.
The typical porter or shunter at Llanelli railway station would have got around 20 shillings a week or less. Most miners in South Wales, for example, at that time would have been on something like 30 to 34 shillings a week.
By August 1911, the struggle for a living wage had become a national strike. The rail unions pleaded for fairness, but the Liberal government supported the owners and showed very little sympathy.
The railway lines were where you carried troops, where you carried goods, where you actually conducted much of your business. The idea of a railway strike, therefore, filled them with horror.
On Thursday, August the 17th, the leaders of the main railway unions met the Prime Minister and Lloyd George as Chancellor of the Exchequer in London. They informed them that they were rejecting the offer of yet another commission of inquiry into their grievances, and when they told the Prime Minister, Hubert Asquith, that they were going to go ahead with their plans for a national strike, his response was, "Then your blood be on your own heads."
In Llanelli, they didn't think it would affect them at all. So much so, the Chief Constable decided to send the main body of police constables in Llanelli off to where there would be real trouble further down the line, Swansea, Cardiff, wherever. While they were away, of course, Llanelli experienced far more trouble than anyone anticipated.
There were just a few hundred members of the rail union in Llanelli, but the crucial thing is they were joined by hundreds of other workers. And one of the main strike leaders was a signalman called John Bevan. He told a local reporter, "We're out for victory and our forces are ready." Well, they might have been ready, but the authorities clearly weren't.
Well, I'm Ron Bevan, and John Bevan was my grandfather, better known to his colleagues as signalman Jack Bevan. And on the night of the 17th, he had the gates closed, the eastern end gates. All the men congregated around there, and the mood at that time was quite good.
Well, around the railway station, you have a crowd estimated at between 3,000 and 5,000. Now, there were only 500 railway workers. Where did the others come from? Well, they were actually the people in heavy industry like tinwork, steelwork, foundry workers, brewery workers, even who had come in solidarity.
They held mock elections. There was an impromptu Eisteddfod. John Bevan did actually offer to put up any stranded passengers as well. But what was important that the gates did stay shut and they were manned all night, so no trains could pass through.
The fact is that Llanelli was a strategically important railway station on the main line from London to Fishguard, a prime link between Britain and Ireland. And yet, it was vulnerable. Why? Well, because there was just one way in through those gates there on Station Road and just one way out along the line, a quarter of a mile to the west. And when the gates were shut, nothing could move. So on the evening of the 17th, all approaching trains came to a standstill as the few remaining policemen in the town just stood and watched. But as Friday the 18th dawned, the situation and the mood were about to change.
One of Llanelli's magnates, as it were, Thomas Jones, Justice of the Peace, and also a very big shareholder in the Great Western Railway, sent for troops. There was a pool of troops in Cardiff, and the troops arrived and he was there to meet them outside the gates at 7:30 on Friday morning. So the first troops to arrive were 127 men from the North Lancashire Regiment. As it turns out, they were vastly outnumbered and they failed in their attempts to get the gates reopened. So what did they do? They set up camp on the outskirts of the town and sent out for reinforcements. These arrived about 4:30, and they were mainly Worcestershires, a very highly disciplined regiment.
And the moment the troops arrived from the Worcester Regiment, the atmosphere changed. And I think that, to me, is the triggering point. So what can we say about the Worcestershire Regiment? Well, they had a long, illustrious, and it has to be said, rather bloody history. Back in 1770, they'd fired on a crowd in Boston in Massachusetts. It was one of the seeds of the American Revolution. And that episode earned them a nickname, the Vein Openers.
They were guarding the custom house in Boston, and there was a riot, and they opened fire and killed 3 protesters. It is still known in America as the Boston Massacre.
Their commanding officer on that August weekend in 1911 was Major Burleigh Francis Brownlow Stewart.
He was commissioned before the Boer War. He served in the Boer War and got accelerated promotion during the Boer War to the rank of Major.
Well, Major Stewart certainly knew how to take action because those eastern gates were retaken, lost, and then retaken again at bayonet point on the evening of the 18th of August. The train started to move again. Surely that was it. Problem solved. Well, it wasn't, because on Saturday the 19th of August 1911, the crowd's attention shifted to the western end, and this would turn out to be the darkest of days.
A train appears at about 2 o'clock in the afternoon going west. There was something wrong about this train. There was something suspicious about it. The strikers weren't really willing to let it pass.
It is said the driver had been encouraged to drive through the use of, as you might say, intoxicating liquor. But certainly he was incapacitated.
My grandfather went in front of the train, lay across the track, and said, if this train goes through Llanelli, passes over my dead body. And of course all our family very proud of that brave act.
The train stopped with a large embankment on one side, with a lot of houses. And from that embankment, some of the young lads began to throw stones, began to shout abuse.
And they get hold of the driver and manhandled him, and railwaymen rake out the fire in the engine. So the engine is now immobilized. This train is not going anywhere anymore. The next thing that happens is that Major Stewart of the Worcesters brings 80 of his men up. They line up on each side of the train, bayonets drawn.
Let's think about what was really going on here, because the soldiers found themselves in the worst possible position. Why? Well, they were stuck in a culvert and they were surrounded by crowds on both sides on these banks. Bryn Road on this side and High Street up there.
Major Stewart climbed up from the bottom of the cutting to talk to the rioters and to try to reason with them, but that didn't prove successful. And eventually, with a lot of rocks and bricks being thrown at them, they had to do something.
He then makes Henry Wilkins, magistrate he'd brought up with him, read the riot act. He hands him, actually, a sheet with a riot act written on it.
Major Stewart gave the crowds a minute to disperse, went through this theatrical performance of taking out his watch, timing, etc.
He mumbles through the riot act reluctantly as it comes out in the inquest, and Major Stewart draws up a firing squad of 5 men.
We still to this day don't know whether the order to shoot was given or whether somebody just fired, but certainly a volley followed, and it was in that moment that 2 young men on the embankment overlooking the train were killed.
Now, Major Stewart had initially remonstrated with a group of people who'd gathered at the back of number 4 High Street, which is just up there. But when the shots were fired, they were directed not at number 4, but at number 6 High Street, which is where we can see the conifer trees today.
There is witness evidence that much of the stone throwing came from the very group of houses where they were standing, and people even reported that Jack John, the young football player, had bared his chest and said, "Shoot me."
Now, you're not shooting in the air, you're not shooting with rubber bullets at all. They're shooting to kill, and they actually do kill.
John Francis was hit in the throat and slumped down in the back garden of number 6, wounded. John was shot through the heart and killed instantly. Leonard Wurzel was also shot dead, and Benjamin Hanbury was wounded.
So the 4 men were carried from the railway embankment, that's just beyond those trees, and brought into this garden. This is the garden of number 6 High Street. They discovered that the bullet that killed Jack John had also injured Ben Hanbury. And how's this for a twist of fate? One of the owners of number 6 today is a Hanbury.
My name is Janet Williams. My maiden name was Hanbury. My grandfather was Ivor Hanbury and his younger brother was Ben. When we bought the house about 20 years ago, we had no idea of the history behind it at all. Neighbours told us of a few details as the years went by, and then I put 2 and 2 together. And then I remembered a childhood story that my great uncle had been shot. To think that 2 men died in my garden and were pronounced dead on my living room floor is quite haunting. It's not something I like to think about a lot.
Here we are, a century on from what happened. The shootings happened just a few yards away. What are your thoughts today?
The British forces killed 2 innocent people, and there's never been any apology or explanation or anything as to why they done it. It's all been kept very, very quiet.
It's a crucial point, isn't it? 100 years on. Do you think an apology would be appropriate?
Well, something needs to be done. If it happened in this day and age, there'd be court cases, there'd be appeals, there'd be goodness knows what.
Jack John was laid to rest here at Llanelli Public Cemetery. Leonard Wurzel is buried just a few yards away. And I have to say, it is a shocking thing when you read the wording on the gravestone, the graphic detail of his death at the age of 21. And if it's shocking for us, imagine what it is for the John family, who are still living in Llanelli today.
My name is Carol Slade. My maiden name was John. Jack was my father's older brother, so Jack John was my uncle. The family never spoke about it. I never heard my father mention it at all. The first I remember hearing about it was when my eldest daughter was in Coedca School, and